I buried my father twice, once in the ground, and once in ink. The first time, I stood over his coffin, rain soaking through my suit, trying to convince myself it was over. The second time, I sat in a lawyer's office, staring at a signature that wasn't his, careful, practiced, perfect in all the wrong ways. That forged name killed him again. It stole his truth, rewrote his legacy, and left me standing in the ruins of a life I thought I understood. Everyone called it fate, a family secret revealed, a lost son returned. But I knew better. It wasn't fate. It was fraud. And I wasn't just my father's heir anymore. I was his avenger. The rain started before the service, a slow, stubborn drizzle that turned the cemetery mud into black glass. I remember watching the drops slide down the polished mahogany of my father's coffin and thinking it looked too perfect, too staged. He'd been a practical man, allergic to extravagance, and yet everything about that morning screamed money, hired mourners, curated sorrow, expensive umbrellas stamped with the funeral home's logo. People I didn't know shook my hand like they'd rehearsed it. They said my father was a good man, the kind that leaves a fine legacy. But I could see it in their eyes, curiosity. They weren't there for him. They were there for the story. And then I saw him. He stood apart from the crowd, hands clasped behind his back, a figure in a dark gray suit that fit too well for a stranger. He looked about my age, maybe a few years younger, tall, with a calmness that didn't match the day. For a moment, our eyes met, his were green, my father's color, and he nodded at me with a kind of intimacy that twisted my stomach. I didn't know it then, but that single look would rewrite my entire life. When the priest droned through the eulogy, my mind drifted. I kept replaying the last time I saw my father, frail, barely able to lift a glass of water, but still sharp enough to make a joke about my tie. He hadn't mentioned another son. Not once. Not in all 32 years of my life. As the casket lowered, I felt the world tilt. I wanted to feel grief, clean and simple, but something else clawed at the edges of it, suspicion. That man in the gray suit was watching again, head bowed in theatrical reverence. He placed a single white rose on the grave, then turned and left without a word. I asked my aunt who he was. She hesitated just long enough to make my pulse quicken. Someone from your father's earlier years, she said, eyes darting away. He said he wanted to pay his respects. Earlier years. The phrase landed like a stone in my chest. That night, I couldn't sleep. I replayed every detail of that stranger, his posture, his confidence, the faint smirk when he caught me staring. It wasn't grief I saw in his face. It was ownership. The next morning, the call started. A lawyer, my father's old estate attorney, Mr. Holloway, wanted me to come in for the will reading. There have been some updates, he said over the phone. Updates. The word was too casual for what it turned out to mean. I remember standing by the window, watching the rain turn to fog over the city skyline, feeling that same hollow ache I'd felt at the graveside. My father's death was supposed to be an ending, closure, however painful. But now it felt like a beginning. Something was moving beneath the surface, quiet and deliberate. And somehow, I knew that man in the gray suit would be waiting for me on the other side of it. Mr. Holloway's office was the kind of place where the furniture smelled like control, dark walnut desk, leather chairs that swallowed you whole, walls lined with degrees that doubled as shields. I'd been there before with my father, years ago, when he added me as executor. Back then, Holloway had been warm, almost paternal. Now, he didn't offer a handshake. Condolences, Michael, he said flatly, motioning toward a chair. His eyes flickered to the door just as it opened. And there he was. The man from the funeral. He entered with the confidence of someone who'd been here many times before. Gray suit again, same restrained smile, same disquieting calm. Apologies for being late, he said, voice smooth enough to belong on the radio. Holloway nodded as if he'd been expecting him. That's quite all right, Daniel. Shall we begin? Daniel. The name meant nothing to me then, but hearing it spoken with such familiarity felt like a theft. Holloway shuffled a thick envelope, tapping its edge on the desk. Your father's final testament and last will, he announced, tone rehearsed. Executed 2 months prior to his passing. He began reading, the cadence formal, detached. My father's assets scrolled out like a ledger of his life, the company shares, the house, the car collection, the lake cabin he'd rebuilt by hand. Every line was a reminder of the man I'd spent years trying to impress. Then Holloway's voice shifted. To my beloved son, Daniel Crane, I leave the remainder of my estate in full control of Crane Engineering. Silence. The kind that hums in your ears. I blinked, sure I'd misheard. I'm sorry, Who? Holloway didn't look at me. Your father had a son prior to your birth. He recently reconnected with him. I felt heat rise in my chest. Reconnected? My father was dying. He could barely hold a pen. Daniel interjected softly, we'd spoken for years, actually. He reached out first. He wanted to make things right. I turned toward him, searching for even a flicker of truth. Funny, he never mentioned you. His expression barely changed, but there was something in his eyes, amusement, maybe pity. Grief clouds memory, he said. I looked at Holloway. I want to see the signature. He hesitated. Of course. He slid the document toward me. My father's name was scrawled across the bottom, but wrong. Too clean, too deliberate. He always signed with a quick stroke that slanted upward. This one slanted down, every letter cramped. A forgery doesn't scream at first glance, it whispers, like a lie told too perfectly. That's not his hand, I said. Holloway's lips tightened. I assure you, the will was executed in accordance with all legal requirements. Daniel gave a small sigh, as though bored by the whole affair. Look, I understand this is difficult, he said. But your father made peace with his past. You should try to do the same. The way he said your father instead of our father, like a slip in a bad script, told me everything. I left the office with the will burning a hole in my mind. Outside, the sky had gone the color of rust. I could still see Daniel's reflection in the window as I turned away, calm, smug, unshaken. For the first time, I felt something heavier than grief. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about truth, about the idea that someone could rewrite my father's life while he lay dying, and everyone would nod along. As I walked into the evening fog, I whispered it out loud, just to hear how it sounded. The will was a lie. It didn't echo. It settled. Like the beginning of something that refused to stay buried. In the weeks that followed, Daniel Crane became a ghost that wouldn't stay dead. His name surfaced everywhere, whispered at the grocery store, murmured in half sentences when I walked into a room. People said he'd come home, that he was the real heir. I watched as the narrative rewrote itself in real time. One week, I was the devoted son who'd taken care of my father through his illness. The next, I was the spoiled mistake who'd lost everything to bloodline and fate. Daniel, meanwhile, played the role perfectly. He moved into my father's house before the flowers on the grave had wilted. Photos began popping up on local business sites. Daniel Crane, continuing his father's legacy at Crane Engineering. There he was behind Dad's desk, wearing his watch, his tie clip. The press release even used one of Dad's old headshots beside Daniel's new portrait, their faces side by side like prophecy fulfilled. I drove past the house one night. The lights were on in the study, the same study where I'd done my homework while Dad drafted blueprints late into the night. Daniel was standing by the window, glass in hand, backlit by the same lamp Dad had built himself. For a long moment, he stared out into the darkness. Then he smiled, that same quiet, deliberate smile I'd seen at the funeral. It wasn't joy. It wasn't relief. It was ownership. Something in me snapped. I parked down the street and walked the block, just to see if I could get closer, to prove to myself that I wasn't imagining it. From the gate, I could see details through the open blinds, the silver pen on the desk, the framed photo of me and Dad at a fishing dock. Only the frame had been turned around, facing the wall. I clenched the metal bars until my palm stung. That's when a motion sensor light flared, washing the yard in sterile white. Daniel looked up and, for one chilling second, our eyes met through the glass. He didn't flinch. He raised his glass slightly, a mock toast, and mouthed something I couldn't hear. Then he drew the curtains. I stood there, shaking, until the cold crept into my bones. The next morning, I went to the office of Crane Engineering. My father's old assistant, Linda, looked at me like I was an intruder. Mr. Crane isn't taking visitors, she said automatically. I'm Mr. Crane, I snapped. She hesitated, eyes darting toward the frosted glass door at the end of the hall. The nameplate now read Daniel Crane, CEO. Please, she whispered. Just let it go. It's already decided. I left before security had a reason to escort me out. Outside, the winter wind felt surgical, cutting through the fog in my head. Everyone had accepted the lie because it was simpler than asking questions. But simplicity isn't truth. And I'd inherited something stronger than money, my father's stubbornness. That night, I dug through the boxes of his old files that I'd salvaged before the house changed hands. Receipts, company memos, drafts of blueprints, all neatly ordered in his handwriting. My father never did anything halfway. But the folder labeled estate planning, the one that should have held his original will, was gone. My pulse spiked. I tore through every drawer, every box, every binder. Nothing. Someone had erased him. When I sat down on the floor, surrounded by piles of old paperwork, I felt something hard under the rug, a false board in the floor. Inside was a small fireproof safe, one I'd never seen before. I pried it open with a hammer. Inside were two things: a stack of letters addressed to me that I'd never received, and a copy of his signature on a fishing license renewal form. When I held that license beside the will photocopy Holloway had shown me, the difference was unmistakable. The signature on the will leaned down, my father's hand always leaned up. The forgery wasn't just possible, it was obvious. And Daniel's smile at the window? Now I understood it. He wasn't smiling at me. He was smiling because he thought I'd never fight back. For 3 nights, I lived in my father's old study surrounded by paper towers, the life's work of a man who'd built an empire from blueprints and stubbornness. Every drawer smelled like dust and ink, every document was a breadcrumb, but the trail led nowhere. The estate folder, the heart of everything, was missing. Someone had erased it cleanly. Too cleanly. When you grow up around an engineer, you learn that systems don't fail by accident. Someone has to loosen a bolt. Someone has to want it broken. I started by retracing the timeline. 2 months before his death, Dad was in and out of the hospital. He'd been lucid, but weak, hands trembling, speech slurred. Holloway claimed the will had been signed then. But the hospital had a strict witness policy for legal documents. Every signature required staff verification. So I called the hospital records department. The nurse on duty that day remembered my father, the one who kept joking about wanting to outlive his own company. Her laugh was soft, apologetic. But no, sir, no one from a law office came that week. We'd have logged it. I hung up and stared at the receiver. The silence afterward felt heavier than proof. If Holloway hadn't been there, then where had this will come from? I began calling everyone who'd known my father in his last months, his business partner, his accountant, even the neighbor who watered his plants. The same phrase kept coming back: Mr. Holloway handled it personally. That night, I sat down with both signatures under a desk lamp, the forged one on the will, the real one from the fishing license. Side by side, the differences screamed. The slant, the loop of the R, the spacing between the letters. The forged version looked hesitant, like someone had traced confidence but forgotten motion. It wasn't just wrong. It was practiced. So I scanned both signatures and sent them to a forensic handwriting analyst 2 towns over, using a throwaway email. I told her the story in vague terms: estate dispute, possible forgery. She promised to get back to me within the week. But the universe doesn't wait politely. The next morning, I got a call from Linda, my father's old assistant. Her voice was tight, whispering like someone listening through the walls. "Michael, you didn't hear this from me," she said. "But Holloway came in this morning. He was shredding files, old ones. Stuff with your dad's name on it. When I asked what it was, he said it was posthumous privacy maintenance." Then Daniel showed up. They went into his office for nearly an hour. The air in my lungs turned to static. "Did you see what they were shredding?" "Some estate paperwork. Letterheads from your dad's company, and I swear, one of them looked like it had his signature." I felt dizzy. "Linda, can you?" "No. I can't," she whispered. "They're already watching me. Please, just be careful." The line went dead. That night, I drove to Holloway's office. The building was dark except for the faint amber light of his desk lamp behind the blinds. I parked across the street, camera in hand. Through the slats, I saw him feeding documents into a shredder, slow, deliberate, methodical. Daniel was there too, sitting in the corner, arms crossed. Whatever they were destroying, it wasn't paperwork. It was evidence. I snapped photos from the car, zoomed in through the glass. At one point, Holloway lifted a page toward the light before feeding it in. For a fraction of a second, I saw my father's name, Arthur Crane, and the faint curve of a forged signature. My hands trembled around the camera. The sound of the shredder buzzed across the street, like something being buried alive. When I finally drove away, my reflection in the rearview mirror looked like someone else entirely, someone who'd stopped mourning and started planning. This wasn't just theft. It was surgery, removing my father's legacy one piece at a time. And they thought I wouldn't notice. But I was my father's son. And I was about to make them remember that. The analyst called on a Sunday night, right as the streetlights outside my apartment flickered on. Her voice was brisk and professional, the kind you hear from someone who's spent years staring at lies written in ink. Mr. Crane, she began, I've completed your comparison. I wanted to confirm before sending the full report, the signatures are not from the same hand. For a few seconds, I couldn't speak. Not even close? She hesitated. Not close at all. The forged one mimics your father's rhythm, but it's unnatural, hesitant, careful. Whoever did this had a reference sample. They likely practiced multiple times. I sank into my chair. Around me, the apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Can you prove that legally? I can testify to it, she said. But you'll need a chain of custody, official copies, not scans. That would mean getting the original will from Holloway. The same Holloway who was now shredding documents and meeting in secret with the man who'd stolen my inheritance. I thanked her, took down every technical note she offered, and hung up. For a long moment, I stared at my father's real signature, the one from his fishing license, laid out beside the printout of the forgery. They looked like echoes of the same man, one alive and defiant, the other hollow and still. That's when the door buzzer sounded. I froze. It was nearly 10 p.m. When I looked through the peephole, there was no one there, just an envelope lying on the floor. Inside was a note written in black ink. You should stop digging, Michael. Some legacies aren't meant to be shared. No signature. The handwriting was clean and deliberate, the same kind of careful slant I'd just seen on the forgery. I spent that night pacing. My rational mind told me to go to the police, but I knew how this looked, a grieving son obsessed with conspiracy theories about a will. No one would believe me until I had something undeniable, something that couldn't be spun as delusion. So the next morning, I called the county clerk's office and requested a certified copy of my father's last recorded will. They told me there was a waiting period. I told them I'd wait. 3 days later, I got the package. The seal was fresh, official, stamped. And there, under the notary mark, was the same forged signature. But this time, something new caught my eye, the witness names. 2 of them. One was Holloway. The other was someone named D. Crane. Daniel had witnessed the will that gave him everything. That was the kind of arrogance that could undo an empire. I scanned the document, photographed every line, then drove to the handwriting analyst's office 2 towns over to hand her the originals. When she saw the witnesses' names, she raised an eyebrow. That's convenient, she muttered. We spent an hour going over every loop, every hesitation, every line of pen pressure. The evidence wasn't just suggestive anymore. It was damning. When I left her office, the night air felt cleaner. For the first time since the funeral, the anger didn't feel wild. It felt focused. I drove past Holloway's building again on the way home. The lights were on in his office, just like before. He was sitting alone this time, flipping through files. I parked across the street, rolled down the window, and let the cold air sting my face. In the reflection of his window, I could see my own car, headlights off, engine silent. He looked up, as if sensing he was being watched. For the first time, I didn't flinch. I wanted him to see me. I wanted him to know I wasn't grieving anymore. The next step wasn't about suspicion. It was about proof, and punishment. I was done being a son. Now, I was becoming something else entirely. By the time I walked into Holloway's office again, I'd already rehearsed every line. Not the kind that begged or accused, the kind that baited. He looked surprised to see me but masked it quickly behind his usual professional detachment. Michael, he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I thought we'd concluded all estate matters. I smiled back. I just wanted some clarity, Mr. Holloway. About my father's intentions. He gestured for me to sit. I did, carefully placing my phone, already recording, screen down on his desk. I've been reviewing some of Dad's old files, I began, and I realized the timelines. Confusing. You said he signed the new will at the hospital, right? Yes. A private session, he said quickly. He wanted it that way. I nodded, pretending to believe him. Interesting. Because the hospital says no outside witnesses were allowed that week. For the first time, he blinked too long. Perhaps you're mistaken. I leaned forward. Maybe. Or maybe someone forged a dying man's name. His hand twitched, just slightly, toward the folder on his desk. Michael, I understand your grief. It can make things. Grief doesn't change handwriting, I cut in. Silence. He leaned back slowly, measuring me. The fluorescent light above us hummed like an insect. Then his tone changed, quieter, more deliberate. Be careful, son. You don't want to make enemies you can't afford. Is that a threat? A warning. I stood. Good. I'll take it seriously. As I turned to leave, I caught a reflection in the glass wall, movement down the hall. Daniel was standing there, watching through the frosted window, a faint grin on his face. He'd been listening. When I stepped outside into the parking lot, my hands shook, but not from fear. I'd caught it, the slip, the hesitation, the crack in the facade. Holloway wasn't just protecting Daniel. He was afraid of something, or someone. I drove to a diner off the interstate and sat in my car, replaying the recording. His tone, the pauses, the moment he deflected about the hospital, all of it was enough to raise suspicion, but not to convict. Not yet. I needed something that would bury him in his own words. Over the next week, I built a trap. I called Holloway again, this time pretending to be apologetic. I said I'd overreacted, that I'd found more of Dad's paperwork and wanted help sorting it out. I made my voice sound exhausted, beaten. He took the bait. "Why don't you come in on Friday?" he said. "We'll review everything together." Friday came. I wore a small lapel pin with a micro recorder inside, a gift from a friend who worked in private security. Hidden, legal, and clean. When I arrived, Holloway was alone. Daniel wasn't there, not yet. I placed a stack of harmless blueprints on his desk and waited. "I just want to understand," I said. "Why would my father change everything so suddenly?" He sighed, as if performing patience. "Your father made mistakes, Michael. You know that." Daniel was part of his past. He wanted to set things right. "So you helped him." I executed his wishes. Even when he couldn't sign them himself? He froze, then gave me a cold smile. "You really should let this go. People grieve differently, but obsession." That's when Daniel walked in. He glanced between us, confusion flickering before his mask returned. "Everything okay here?" he asked smoothly. "Perfect," I said. "I was just asking how you managed to witness a will for a dying man you supposedly reconnected with months before he passed." His eyes narrowed. "Excuse me?" "You were listed as a witness, Daniel." I reached into my coat and pulled out the certified copy. "You signed off on the document that gave you everything." "Convenient." For a split second, he looked at Holloway. The lawyer's face went pale. That was the moment I wanted, the crack that couldn't be rehearsed. I gathered my papers and stood. "Thank you both for your time. I think I have what I need." Daniel started to speak, but Holloway raised a hand. His knuckles were white. "Be careful, Michael," he said again. This time, it didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like a confession. Outside, the air tasted metallic. I walked to my car with the recording still running, my pulse steady now. No anger. Just precision. They thought I was chasing ghosts. But I was cataloging sins. And soon, I'd make their lies speak louder than I ever could. The first crack appeared in the form of a phone call, a voice from my father's past that neither Holloway nor Daniel could have predicted. It was Susan Mercer, one of my dad's oldest friends and a retired bookkeeper from his company. Her tone was hesitant at first, like she wasn't sure if she should be calling at all. "I've been hearing stories," she said, "about this other son." I thought it was nonsense. But then I remembered something odd. I held my breath. "What kind of odd?" She hesitated, then said quietly, "Months before your father went into the hospital, I stopped by Holloway's office to drop off company paperwork. Daniel Crane was there. They said he was an investor." I closed my eyes. "Are you sure it was him?" "Positive. He introduced himself. Same name, same face I saw in the papers after your father passed. And Michael." He called Holloway by his first name. The ground shifted under me. Daniel hadn't appeared out of nowhere after my father's death. He'd been planted in the picture, months before, while Dad was still alive, maybe even before he'd fallen ill. After the call, I just sat there in silence, letting that truth settle like a storm cloud ready to break. Then I picked up my notebook and wrote it down. Proof of connection: Daniel met Holloway before the will. It wasn't enough for an arrest, not yet, but it was the first domino. Over the next few days, I began to dig into Daniel's background. The name Daniel Crane appeared nowhere before 3 years ago. Not in birth records, school registries, tax filings, nothing. It was as if he'd been written into existence halfway through my father's illness. But I knew where to look. My father had mentioned a young contractor once, a guy he'd mentored for a few months, Daniel Cooper. Ambitious, clever, desperate to make something of himself. The pieces started to rearrange. Cooper. Crane. Just one name away from legitimacy. I reached out to a friend who worked in corporate investigations, someone who owed me a favor. 2 days later, he called back. "Your guy changed his name legally 18 months ago," he said. "From Cooper to Crane. Guess who filed the witness affidavit for that change?" "Don't say it." "Holloway." My hands clenched around the phone. They hadn't found a secret son. They'd made one. That same evening, I drove to Susan's house. She greeted me at the door with cautious warmth, gray hair in a neat bun, glasses perched low on her nose. Her house smelled of lemon polish and nostalgia. "I shouldn't have waited this long," she said, handing me a folder. "Your father sent me these to review for tax season, but he never followed up. I forgot to return them." Inside were older drafts of his estate planning documents, the real ones. Typed, dated, and signed nearly a year before the supposed updated will. My name was listed as the sole heir and executor. The signature was genuine. It was irrefutable proof that the forgery wasn't just altered, it was fabricated from nothing. "Thank you," I said softly. She squeezed my hand. "Arthur loved you. Don't let them turn that into a lie." That night, I pinned everything to my wall: names, dates, documents, phone logs. My apartment looked like a detective's nightmare: string, photos, highlighted notes. In the center, I pinned my father's photo, smiling, sleeves rolled up, grease under his fingernails. I'd spent my whole life trying to be half the man he was. But now, I realized what he taught me best: when something's broken, you don't mourn it. You fix it. The next morning, I called the district attorney's office. The woman who answered sounded skeptical at first, until I mentioned forgery, false witnesses, and financial gain. Her tone changed. "We'll need formal statements," she said. "And the originals, if possible." "I have them," I said. When I hung up, the fear was gone. For weeks I'd felt like I was walking through a fog of someone else's version of reality. But now, for the first time, the ground felt solid. I'd caught them mid-lie. And I wasn't stopping until the whole world heard it break. By the time I walked into the district attorney's office, I was no longer a son fighting grief, I was a witness carrying a paper bomb. The receptionist barely looked up until I set the folder on the counter. "I have evidence of will forgery and estate fraud," I said, my voice low, steady. "Two parties involved, Daniel Crane and attorney Martin Holloway." That got her attention. Within an hour, I was sitting across from an investigator named Klein, mid-40s, calm, analytical eyes that missed nothing. He flipped through my documents with surgical precision. "You compiled all this yourself?" he asked. "Yes. I have recordings, email logs, corroborating witness testimony, and handwriting analysis." He raised an eyebrow. "You've done half our job already." I didn't smile. "Then finish the other half." Klein leaned back, tapping his pen against the folder. "You realize these are serious accusations. Holloway's well connected. If we move too soon, this could backfire." "I'm aware," I said. "But if we move too late, he'll destroy the rest of the evidence." He studied me for a long moment before nodding. "We'll start discreetly." Over the next 2 weeks, I became both informant and ghost. Every day after work, I'd meet Klein or one of his assistants at the courthouse cafe, exchanging new findings like contraband. They verified the witness signatures, subpoenaed Holloway's office records, and quietly reached out to the notary listed on the will. The notary's statement cracked the door wide open. She didn't remember witnessing any will that day, and when shown the document, she paled. "That's my seal," she said, "but not my signature." Forgery layered on forgery. Klein called me one evening. "We're moving on it," he said. "But you should know something. Holloway's been shredding files again. We think he suspects." "Good," I said. "Let him sweat." That night, I drove by his office. Police lights reflected off the glass. They'd already raided the place, paper trails scattered, hard drives bagged, the law's cold efficiency replacing my private obsession. Still, I didn't feel vindicated. Not yet. Because Daniel was still out there. When the police brought him in for questioning, it made the local news. Alleged heir under investigation in inheritance dispute. The headline was clinical, but seeing his photo on the screen, that practiced calm, that smile, made something deep in me shift. He'd built his persona on silence and confidence, the kind of man who could lie without blinking. But now, for the first time, his name was being dragged into daylight. I couldn't attend the interrogation, but Klein later told me what happened. "He folded faster than Holloway," he said. Claimed Holloway orchestrated everything, that he was manipulated, used. I laughed. Of course he did. He admitted to changing his name, Klein continued. But insists he thought it was legal. Says he didn't know about the forgery. Do you believe him? Klein gave a small shrug. Not really. But his panic helped us. We've got Holloway cornered. A week later, I was called in to identify handwriting samples and recordings. Sitting across from Holloway in that gray interview room was surreal. He looked smaller without the suit, older without control. When he glanced up and saw me through the glass partition, his expression didn't register shame, just exhaustion. Like a man who'd bet everything and finally run out of chips. Why? I whispered to myself. The investigator beside me answered quietly, greed's a habit. For some, it's also a disease. When I walked out of the courthouse that night, the air smelled like rain again, the same heavy scent as the day we buried my father. But this time, it didn't carry loss. It carried momentum. For the first time in months, I felt like I wasn't standing in his shadow. I was walking beside it. I knew the road ahead would be long, court dates, depositions, lawyers clawing at loopholes, but the worst was already behind me. The silence. The gaslighting. The loneliness of knowing the truth before anyone else would believe it. Now, the system had a name for what they'd done. Fraud. Forgery. Conspiracy. Words that would soon be carved into public record, their legacy, not mine. Still, part of me couldn't shake the feeling that justice wasn't enough. I didn't just want them convicted. I wanted them undone. Because revenge isn't about punishment. It's about symmetry. And we weren't there yet. The courthouse smelled like dust and nerves, that blend of old wood and quiet desperation that seeps into every trial. I'd walked through those doors 100 times in my dreams, but the reality was heavier. The marble floors, the echo of footsteps, the weight of strangers judging your truth. Holloway sat at the defense table, his suit immaculate, his confidence cracked just enough to show through. Daniel was 2 seats away, avoiding eye contact with everyone. He looked smaller now, thinner, the arrogance replaced with something that almost resembled fear. Almost. I took my seat behind the prosecution, the folder of evidence still warm from my grip. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. People versus Martin Holloway and Daniel Crane, the clerk read. Hearing their names together out loud felt surreal, like the final act of a play I hadn't auditioned for. The prosecution opened cleanly, forged signatures, falsified witnesses, digital evidence showing Holloway editing scanned documents from my father's files. Every word felt like a nail driven straight into the coffin of their scheme. Then came the recordings, my recordings. Holloway's voice filled the courtroom, calm but venomous. Be careful, son. You don't want to make enemies you can't afford. I watched the jurors' faces shift. That single line did what documents couldn't, it gave the crime a heartbeat. Then Daniel's cross-examination began. His attorney painted him as a naive pawn, a young man manipulated by a trusted family advisor. Daniel nodded along, eyes glassy, posture fragile. But when the prosecutor pulled up the legal name change form, the one Holloway had signed as witness, Daniel's mask slipped. You expect this court to believe you didn't know the name Crane would benefit you financially? The prosecutor asked. Daniel hesitated, then said, I thought it was symbolic. The laughter that rippled through the courtroom wasn't kind. Holloway's turn came next. The man who'd built a career on precision suddenly couldn't remember dates, couldn't recall conversations, couldn't explain why he'd been at the hospital on a day the staff confirmed he wasn't. When the forged will was projected on the screen beside my father's real signature, the comparison was devastating. Even from the gallery, I could see the tremor in Holloway's jaw. The expert I'd hired testified with crisp authority, her laser pointer circling the telltale flaws, inconsistent pen pressure, mechanical tracing marks, identical hesitation points. She spoke like a surgeon dissecting rot. By the time she stepped down, Holloway looked gutted. Then it was my turn. The prosecutor asked me to describe what the inheritance meant to me, not in dollars, but in principle. I swallowed hard. My father built everything he had with his hands, I said. He taught me that a man's name is worth more than his fortune. These men tried to steal both. They buried him twice, once in the ground, and once on paper. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of someone scribbling notes. When I stepped down, I didn't look back at Holloway or Daniel. I didn't need to. The damage was done. The verdict came 2 weeks later. Holloway, guilty on all counts, fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and perjury. Daniel, guilty on forgery and conspiracy, acquitted on the more complex fraud charge. The jury believed he'd been manipulated, at least partially. When the judge read the sentence, Holloway closed his eyes. 10 years. Daniel got 5. Neither of them looked at me. As they were led away, the air in the room shifted. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't relief. It was something quieter, like the moment after a storm when you realize the wind isn't blowing anymore. Outside, cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions I didn't answer. I just kept walking until the courthouse was a reflection in the glass doors behind me. The fight was over. The truth had teeth. And I'd finally made it bite. But as I drove home, a thought crept in like fog at the edge of the headlights. Justice had fixed the record, yes. But revenge. Revenge was what fixed me. And there was one last thing I needed to do for that. The morning after the verdict, I went back to the house, his house, for the first time since it had been reclaimed. The locks had been changed, the curtains drawn back, the air stale from months of vacancy. Every step through those hallways sounded like walking through an echo of who we used to be. The study was untouched, except for the dust. My father's desk still bore the faint outline of where his drafting lamp once sat. I ran my hand along the wood and imagined him there again, sketching, muttering calculations, the smell of coffee and graphite blending into the hum of his life. For months I'd seen this room as a crime scene. Now it just looked empty. I opened the top drawer. Inside, I found the fountain pen he'd always used, the same model Holloway had tried to imitate when he forged his signature. I turned it over in my hand, feeling its weight. Smooth, balanced, worn by time. The real thing never needed imitation. On the wall above the desk hung a framed blueprint of Crane Engineering's first project, a steel bridge crossing a minor river on the outskirts of town. Beneath the drawing, in his handwriting, was a note I'd forgotten about. What you build should outlast what you own. I stood there for a long time, letting that line sink in. All this time, I'd thought the inheritance was about what he left behind, the money, the company, the legacy. But maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was about how you defend it. How you carry the truth when no one else will. The court restored everything that had been stolen, the assets, the shares, the estate. But I didn't want them anymore. They'd been tainted, dragged through too much bloodless greed. So I sold it all, the cars, the company, even the lake cabin he loved so much. Every dollar went into a foundation I named after him, the Arthur Crane Scholarship Fund. It supports students studying engineering, especially those who've lost family to financial fraud. Justice written in numbers and blueprints, the way he would have understood it best. The first letter from a scholarship recipient arrived 6 months later. A young woman from Ohio, first in her family to attend college. Your father's story inspired me, she wrote. Not because he was successful, but because you made sure his truth couldn't be rewritten. I cried for the first time in a year reading that. Not out of pain. Out of relief. Sometimes I still see Daniel's face in my mind, that smirk at the funeral, the arrogance that thought it could rewrite bloodlines. Then I remember the last image of him in court, wrists cuffed, mouth trembling when the judge said guilty, and Holloway, the man who thought control was power, reduced to a headline, his law license revoked, his name forever tied to the word forgery. They both exist now in public record, sealed behind glass like insects in amber. That's their eternity. Mine is quieter. I walk the bridge my father built every Sunday morning. It's small, humble, but when the light hits the steel just right, it glows gold. He used to say bridges are the most honest things man can build, they connect what was once divided. I stop at the midpoint every time and whisper, we're even now, Dad. And in that silence, that perfect, balanced silence, I finally believe it.